and welcome to Mississippi Inside. I'm Melanie Christopher, in this week for Byron Brown. Now this week, both candidates for Secretary of State voiced their support for a new ballot initiative process. We'll hear from Republican incumbent Michael Watson and his Democratic challenger, Ty Pinkins. Also, Representative Lee Yancey of Rankin County joins Richard Lake to talk about the medical marijuana program, working with the heir apparent to the House Speaker's job, and more. That's all straight ahead this Sunday on Mississippi Insight. It has been 2 years since the Mississippi Supreme Court struck down the ballot initiative process. Ever since then, lawmakers and now candidates for statewide office on both sides of the aisle have been in favor of restoring the process. The old process was struck down by the state Supreme Court in 2021, citing discrepancies with the state constitution's signature requirements. Inevitably, it will be the state legislature that will develop any new process. But last week, it was the Secretary of State and his general election opponent who called for that work to begin. We'll hear from Secretary Michael Watson, followed by Ty Pinkins, the newly named Democratic candidate.
First and foremost, I think it's really important to understand it's very important that Mississippians have a voice in this process. The initiative process was put there for a reason, and so when we saw the court strike it, we immediately came and said, look, we want to make sure that we restore this properly for the Mississippians that want to have their voices heard. I think the hook across the street kind of has been, we want to make sure that these aren't outside Superfunded entities that are coming in, pushing something that Mississippians may not really like. So I think that is the question of what should that threshold be to actually reflect that it's a Mississippi groundswell of support for an issue. So that's an important piece that I think people need to think through, and I think that's what is really giving the legislature some heartburn about making sure they get this thing right. The number roughly 106, 110, somewhere in that off the top of my head, is what it used to be. So I think and I don't know if there's a math equation that says, hey, look, this really reflects a groundswell for Mississippians. When you have these outside entities that are hiring individuals to come in and get these signatures, how does that reflect well on the voices of Mississippians as opposed to an outside entity that really wants something to pass? So I don't know that there's a magic number. And I think that, again, is the hook where the legislature has really been struggling. How do we make sure that this is an issue that Mississippians truly want as opposed to something pushing, or some entity pushing it on?
Right. The frequency of which it's been utilized has been brought up for supporters saying, look, it's only been come up like a handful of times. Does that matter to you in just the sense of it being there and its presence?
I don't really think the frequency matters. Now, I will say nationally, we've seen that increase across the country. But at the end of the day, what's important is the voice of Mississippians. And if it's something that they want to use frequently because it's a groundswell of an issue that they really want to support, so be it. But again, we've got to make sure that there's a fine balance here between making sure Mississippians' voices are heard as opposed to outside entities coming in.
What do you make of last year's measure that died that specifically said you can use it for anything but abortion rights? What did you make of that?
Again, that's something the legislature has to define, and something that we get in with the mechanics of it after it hits the ballot. So actually before that. But as far as that specific question goes, again, that's something the legislature has to deal with, and we will obviously follow the law.
Absolutely. As far as a true ballot initiative, would you say that a true one has to include all facets of what Mississippians might deem to be put on the Constitution?
It's a good question. I think you want to hear Mississippians' voices. There are some things, a great example with medical marijuana. What we saw was, I don't think that was a good idea to have all of that into the Constitution. There are some pieces of that clearly need to be legislative. Obviously, we've seen some changes, discussions of other changes as well. So I think you've got to be really careful with that. What do you put into the Constitution as opposed to what should be in statute? So that's a hard one to really define.
But I think the most important role of the Secretary of State is that of Chief Elections Officer, making sure that all Mississippians have access to the ballot box, making sure that all Mississippians' voices are heard. And that's where I want to focus at. I want to focus on making sure that when Mississippians go to the ballot box, one, they trust that their vote is being counted, and two, for me, more importantly, that there are no unnecessary barriers in the way of them getting access to the ballot box. We need to restore the ballot initiative, modernize Mississippi's archaic, outdated, and inefficient and restrictive voter registration process. We need to extend the number of days that Mississippians have to vote early. And we also need to do away with Mississippians needing a specific reason to vote early. All of those things, they suppress the number of Mississippians who come out to vote because, frankly, we're in the bottom 10% with regard to voter participation. Those states that are in the top 10%, they have things like online voter registration and extended access to the ballot box with regard to early voting.
That's Ty Pinkins running against the man we heard from earlier, Michael Watson, for the Secretary of State's office. After the break, our one-on-one discussion with Representative Lee Yancey on Mississippi Insight. Republican Lee Yancey of Rankin County has drawn a lot of attention in recent years for his work on the state's medical marijuana program. That work has led to the opening of cannabis dispensaries across the state and tens of thousands of Mississippians getting their medical cannabis cards. Our senior political correspondent, Richard Lake, spoke with the House Drug Policy Chairman Thursday about the program and legislative prospects for the 2024 session.
It's been over a year and a half since the governor signed medical marijuana legislation into law. Representative Yancey, you were critical in that legislation in crafting that. Are you satisfied with how the state's program has evolved so far?
I think we're one of the fastest growing programs in the country. It's not fast enough for those who are in the business and who would like to see our patient count higher. But since June, we've almost doubled from 13,000 to 25,000 patients. Cards that have been issued, and we have more practitioners who are licensed to certify patients with debilitating conditions. So it's growing, as fast as we expected. Our regulations are interesting. Every time, there are a few bad actors, and we knew there would be, but our Department of Health and Department of Revenue is doing a great job of trying to keep everyone inside the lines and working within the scope of the legislation.
Right. So those regulations, you authored House Bill 1158, which has been signed into law now. It makes medical marijuana easier to obtain for qualified patients. Lets doctors prescribe it a lot easier. Now it also sets up some background checks for dispensaries. Now, what will those changes do for this program?
So it just streamlined the process of getting a card. Before, when someone went to see their practitioner, they had to go home and figure out how to apply for a license. And what we did was we allowed the practitioner to make that a one-step process, where once they were certified, then the practitioner could assist them in registering for the card. So and then we also said the Department of Health had to certify within 10 days rather than 30, whether or not they were eligible to get the card. So it just streamlined the process.
What else is left in legislating out maybe some guardrails that are getting in the way of the program?
Well, there are a number of things that the industry would like to see, but I'm satisfied with where the program is now, and I'd like to see more research dollars invested. I know that there are several of our universities who are interested in participating in research. And the more money that we could put back into the program from the tax dollars generated to study the plant, to see which cannabinoids affect which debilitating conditions, what the dosage should be, then you'll see the cannabis plant treated more like real medicine when you see actual dosages of different cannabinoids, whether it's THC or CBD or CBG or CBN, whatever it is. I'm hoping that the research really takes us, a lot farther down the road, and we could be a world leader in that.
Anything on the program and its possible economic impacts on the state? I know similar states have increased taxes on certain things regarding their medical marijuana programs.
So, I mean, it's a great economic development tool, I guess, for those who would like to be in this business. And the tax dollars certainly are helpful to the state because it does go back to the general fund, and then we do appropriate it back to the Department of Health for regulation purposes for Department of Health and Department of Revenue. But as you know, the money that goes to the general fund, 80% of it is spent on education or Medicaid. And so that's generally our priorities in Mississippi, and it's what consumes most of our time and most of our budget.
Absolutely. You're running unopposed for a new term in the House. There will be a new House Speaker next session. Most observers expect that to be Speaker Pro Tem Jason White. What are your thoughts on White?
I think Jason White is a man of integrity. I've admired him since I was elected to the House in 2019, and he was elected pro tem at the time. He's a very, very capable person, high integrity family man, and I'm very excited to have him as potential speaker and probable speaker in January.
He drew some attention when he told reporters that he wants House lawmakers to fully examine Medicaid expansion next session. Do you agree?
Sure. What he said was that it was on the table to look at it, and I think the headline was a lot more sizzling and tantalizing than the article was. Just the fact that we would actually look at it. So I think what he's promised to do is to examine it and see what the ramifications are for adding that extra level of people to the Medicaid roll, and what that would cost and what that would look like.
What other initiatives do you expect to be front burner here in the 2024 session?
Well, we could revisit the income tax elimination. I don't know that we will, but that is certainly something that was hot and heavy the last several years. I would anticipate there being more, my role, if I were to stay in my lane, would be to talk about drug policy, and we are very concerned about the things that are allowed to be sold in convenience stores, the Delta 8s, the things in the CBD world that are not regulated, and we think that they have more THC than they're advertising that they do, and so generally we find that sometimes people can go to a CBD store or a convenience store and find something more potent than they could get in a medical marijuana dispensary. And so we want to look at those things. There are a number of synthesized drugs that have been approved by the FDA made from cannabis, like Marinol and Epidiolex. But anything that's synthetic is something that we need to look at, whether we ban it or we put restrictions on it in some way. Age restrictions. Something has to be done to get a hold of this drug market.
You mentioned the income tax. Governor Reeves at least seems keen to try and get that eliminated. How would you gauge the appetite of eliminating the income tax in the House right now?
I think that there are a number of people who are still for fully eliminating the income tax. There are a number of people who would like to exercise caution and wait and see what all of the cuts that we've done in the past 6-8 years, how they're going to affect the budget. So far, we're continuing to collect far above the estimates. I think we're $1 billion ahead of the estimate right now. So either the state economist is really trying to put a lowball estimate out there so that we can feel good about ourselves, or is just completely missing it. But we have plenty of money to go around, and we need to be cautious with it. We don't need to waste it. But at the same time, if we're continuing to take in over $1 billion ahead of our estimates, then we're taking in too much money from the taxpayer, and we need to return some of that money to the taxpayer.
On the flip side, Democratic challenger Brandon Presley, very focused on eliminating the grocery tax and cutting some car tag fees in half. If elected governor, how do you think that would play over?
So with the grocery tax, one of the things that's concerning about that, and we certainly could look at eliminating some or part of it or all of it, but our cities are funded by 18.5% of the grocery tax. And so in order to make the cities whole, you would have to raise taxes somewhere else if you completely eliminated the grocery tax. And I don't think anyone wants to see an increase in the sales tax or an increase in income tax anywhere. So that would be a consideration. I think if we were just to eliminate all but the part that the cities get, I don't know that anyone would be opposed to that. And that would be a nice break, for people. Instead of 7 cents or 7%, it'd be maybe 3.5%.
You've authored legislation to change Mississippi's Certificate of Need laws. Can you break down for us why changing those funding regulations could maybe help Mississippi in the middle of this healthcare crisis?
So anyone who wants to open a medical facility in Mississippi has to get the permission from the Department of Health in order to do it. And these certificate of need laws started in the 1970s in the federal government. And the idea was that they were going to control how health care was generated to the public. And so they realized the error of their ways 5 or 6 years into it and repealed the legislation federally. But many of the states continue to have their own certificate of need process because it eliminated competition for hospitals, for nursing homes, for any kind of medical facility. I believe that we've got a problem with healthcare today, with our hospitals today. You hear all about it all the time. But the main issue that I see in Mississippi with our hospital system is that we have declining population in many areas like the Delta. You have a shift from inpatient care to outpatient care. So you no longer have someone going to the hospital and having a baby and staying a week. I mean, you're in and out the next day now. And so the paradigm that existed when these hospitals were built just really doesn't work anymore. And what we need are more emergency care clinics and ambulatory surgical centers, and we need new medical facilities that are focused on the outpatient model. And eliminating the certificate of need laws would allow competition in healthcare and would allow people to have more access to care, more quality to care, and I think less expensive care.
Those pieces of legislation have died in committee most times, and some
One died in my committee.
Yes, sir. and some hospital executives aren't necessarily on the same page on that. Why do you think so?
Well, they're protecting their interests. They're protecting their hospitals. They're protecting their members, and that's very noble of them. But that doesn't solve our hospital problem. Doesn't solve their problem. Expanding Medicaid will not solve their problem. Every single one of them will admit to you that expanding Medicaid will not save our hospitals. And yet I continue to hear that on commercials every day. I'm going to expand Medicaid and save our hospitals. Well, it doesn't save the hospitals. It is a much more complicated issue than that. And, for so many reasons, Medicaid is, if we were to do something, it would have to look a whole lot different than what some other states have done.
And we would love to welcome your thoughts on the state general elections come this November, especially the gubernatorial election.
So I've seen the polls, I'm sure you have, and the Republican candidates seem to have a sizable lead in every race, and that's what I expect.
Absolutely. Representative Lee Yancey,
Yeah.
thank you so much
Thank
for your time.
you very much.
As we record this at week's end, Hinds County leaders are still not ready to reopen some key public services such as tax collection and car tag procurement. The county's computer network was effectively shut down Thursday, September 7th, when an apparent ransomware attack was first noticed. As 12 News' Cameron Smith explains, this episode is proving to be a learning experience for Hinds County administrators and a costly one, too.
At the moment, it appears the county did not have all security measures against such an attack in place. Administrator Kenny Wayne Jones initially told us that Hinds County had done what it could to avoid a breach. But Jones later acknowledged the county was in the process of strengthening their security suite to prevent someone from hacking into the system.
We had our basic malware, we had our ransomware, we had our firewall, we had everything we thought we were supposed to have. We were going to increase some of that because we felt like we were vulnerable to a threat of attack. So we've been talking about that this year. It's just that it came too soon before we could get to it.
Ole Miss Assistant Professor Charlie Walter, an expert in computer science, says hackers could have disrupted the system in a number of ways. They could have sent a phishing email to an employee, or they have found a USB drive laying around the building.
Any piece of software that has to interact with the internet or has to interact with specific people in any way can have a vulnerability that can be exploited by an attacker. You just need someone to download a file, or someone to plug in a USB drive, or someone to visit a website with a computer that can be infected. And then every file on that device can be encrypted kind of in the background without the user even knowing.
Walter says once the issue is resolved, a likely scenario to avoid this in the future would be increasing security for Hinds County and local municipalities across the state of Mississippi. Reporting in Jackson, Cameron Smith, 12 News.
If you have comments or questions about today's show or a suggestion for an interview or segment, just drop us a line. Email our producers. The address is news@wjtv.com. And a big thanks to Representative Lee Yancey for joining us this week. Byron Brown returns next weekend with more of the political and current affairs coverage that you demand. I'm Melanie Christopher. From all of us here at 12 News, make it a great weekend.